This video will cover how you can get this incredible Bloodfiends Arm bleed build going in literally 5 minutes after starting the DLC. Yes, even after the latest Elden Ring patch, this weapon is still very OP, because the patch basically changed nothing at all. So this video will cover any spells, talismans and armor sets you might need for this build, while also covering tips and tricks to get the most out of this build. The Bloodfiend Arm is a colossal weapon that deals physical damage and scales with strength, dexterity, and arcane. The heavy attack causes an AoE blood effect, which adds additional bleeding buildup. However, the effect doesn't occur if you're doing jumping or running heavy attacks. The weapon also comes with Endure as its default Ash of War. And while that's perfectly fine to use, an alternative could be the Royal Knight's Resolve, which buffs the damage of your next attack by a whopping 80%. So when combined with a charged heavy attack and some epic talismans we'll talk about later, your total damage output becomes incredible. Of course, you can never go wrong with a bonk build. Speaking of bonk, you could also use Cragblade. If you're going for a Poise Breaker build, Cragblade will also increase physical attack power by 15%. Now before the patch, Bloodfiend's Arm used to have S scaling on Arcane and used to deal 220 blood loss buildup, but now it only does about 205 bleed and only has A scaling on Arcane. I know, right? It's literally unusable now. I'm just joking, of course, it's still incredibly OP. So if you want maximum physical damage, go for the Occult Affinity. Or if you want very high physical damage plus blood loss buildup, go for the Blood Affinity. Whichever affinity you decide to go with, the main strategy with this build remains the same. Activate your skill of choice, charge up a heavy attack, and just bonk. Now let's talk about armor. I like using the Armor of Solitude for a great combination of fashion and function, since it also has pretty good defense stats. Or an alternative could also be the Rakshasa set. It fits the whole vibe of the Bloodfiend Arm while also increasing your damage output by quite a bit. But also be aware of the extra damage you'll take wearing this. Now let's talk about 7 talismans you could use for this build. The first 2 are essential for maximum damage, and the rest of the talismans would depend on your playstyle. First, the Axe Talisman, which would increase the attack damage of charge attacks by 10%, and the Two-Handed Sword Talisman, which increases damage of all attacks and guard counters performed when two-handing a single weapon by 15%. This is a new one introduced in the DLC, and it does stack with the Axe Talisman for charged heavy attacks, which means a 25% damage increase right there. You can also use the Ritual Sword Talisman to increase all damage by 10% when you're at full health. The only reason I don't use this is because my skill issues stop me from ever being at full health. Anyways, you could even use the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to reduce physical damage taken by 20%. And the Bull Goat's Talisman to raise your poise by 33%. These 2 talismans are great since the DLC enemies hit like a truck, and since this weapon performs best if you're able to hit enemies without being interrupted. Both these talismans will allow you to survive while dealing back incredible damage. And if you're running a Poise Breaker build, you could use the Dagger Talisman, which will boost critical hit damage by 17%, which works well with the weapon's high stagger potential. And finally, if you're using the Blood Affinity, consider using Lord of Blood's Exaltation for even more damage when bleed procs, since it will increase your attack power by 20% every time blood loss is triggered. Now we can take this build one step further by using 2 consumables, a Physic Flask combination, and a spell that will significantly increase your damage. For spells, we're keeping it basic and simple and using Flame Grant Me Strength for that 20% buff on physical damage. You could use the Blood Boil Aromatics to increase your physical damage by 30% and your stamina by 20% at the cost of taking some extra damage yourself. You can also use the new Golden Vow consumable. It literally gives you the entire buff the Golden Vow incantation provides without needing any points in faith. As for your physic, you could use any combination of the following. The Spiked Crack tier. It'll increase your charged attacks by another 15%, and it stacks with all the other buffs too. The Stone Barb Crack tier will increase the posture damage you deal, allowing you to break most enemies in 1 or 2 hits. I'm also using the Opaline Heart tier to increase all damage negation by 15% for 3 minutes. Finally, let's talk about the stats required for this build. I have 60 on Vigor to ensure a robust health pool. This is crucial for our playstyle, which often involves trading hits. The DLC enemies hit hard, and you need to make sure you have enough HP to tank hits if you make any mistakes during your charged attack animations. My mind is at 20. While not as critical as some other stats, having a decent FP pool is important for using Royal Knight's Resolve frequently. You don't want to run out of FP mid-fight when you need that 80% damage boost. I've bumped endurance up to 30. We need to make sure we have enough stamina to constantly be using our charged heavy attacks, and to follow that up with another attack or a dodge. The armor we use for this build is also very heavy, so bumping this up to around 40 to 45 might not be a bad idea either. I'm using Godric's Great Rune to be able to meet my equip load requirements, since it raises all attributes by 5 levels. Strength is at 28, which is just enough to meet the weapon's requirements. If you two-hand the weapon, it'll give you a 50% increase on strength. This effectively becomes 42, which is a decent strength value for our purposes. Dexterity is at the minimum 11 that's required to use Bloodfiends Arm. We don't need to invest more here, as it's not our primary scaling stat. Arcane is crucial for this build as it's the primary scaling stat for the Bloodfiends Arm when using either Blood or Occult Affinity. For a level 150 build, you can have it at 52, but feel free to max this out as much as you can. It not only increases our AR significantly, but also boosts our bleed buildup when using the Blood Affinity. Intelligence is not required for this build, and Faith will depend on if you're using any spells that need it. I have 15 points in Faith so that I can use Flame Grant Me Strength if I need it. If you're already high leveled and are pushing past level 150, I'd recommend first maxing out Arcane at 80 and then putting points into Strength up to about 65. When two-handing the weapon, this will effectively give you 97 Strength, which is just shy of the 99 cap. This will squeeze out some extra AR from the weapon's strength scaling. Now, as for the weapon location, if you start here at the main gate cross, follow this path along the cliffside to make your way to Prospect Town. You'll have to do a bit of parkour to get to the top. Here, the weapon will be a guaranteed drop if you can manage to kill the group of enemies there. Specifically, if you kill this guy, you can see holding the weapon. It seems like you can only obtain one of these drops per game. So if you want to dual wield these, you might need to start a new game plus, or get a friend to drop a copy for you. Now, if you want to try out another incredible DLC weapon, watch this video next for a backhand blade build guide. It's another weapon that does insane amounts of bleed damage, and it might fit your playstyle better. I'll see you there.